Okay, everyone, welcome back from our break. And as you can see, we're joined by a new guest, Professor Eric Nelson, and our own Jason Blakely is going to be hosting the conversation, and I'll pass over the microphone to you.
Thank you, David. Well, we're just so lucky to have Professor Eric Nelson with us today, because it's no exaggeration to say he is one of the most dynamic and well-known political theorists and political historians working in the United States today. Professor Nelson is the Robert M. Barron Professor of Government at Harvard University, and he's up to now focused on early modern political thought, which is partly what brings him to us, since we're thinking so much and reading so much about Thomas More's Utopia and the Renaissance, as Professor Colburn was just telling us about. But one thing that I think is really special about Professor Nelson's scholarship is he goes into the history, and he often unearths really sort of surprising, counterintuitive theoretical insights that have a bearing on the present. So they're sort of unsettling histories. He was advised and worked with the great political historian Quentin Skinner at Cambridge University, who is one of the great historians of our time, really. And so he's the author of a number of scholarly articles and award-winning books. There's The Hebrew Republic, Jewish Sources and Transformation of European Political Thought from 2010, where, among other things, he throws into question the sort of received view that early Jewish thought is very bound to monarchical political theologies, and instead poses the question of whether or not that's a form of false worship, false icons that overlaps well with some of our thinking here at the Nova Forum. The Royalist Revolution, Monarchy in the American Founding from 2014. I highly recommend this book. Basically, Professor Nelson there, among many other things, suggests that the American Revolution was a monarchical one. You heard me correctly, that we actually have the wrong view of the American Revolution. And that was released in 2014, but is a really interesting read after sort of some of the stuff that happened with Trumpism and the consolidation of executive power. And then most recently, he has published The Theology of Liberalism in 2019, where he discusses liberalism as a form of political theology, which is also highly sympathetic to the stuff we've been thinking about here at the Nova Forum. Specifically, liberalism is possibly a form of theodicy, or the problem of evil. And early liberalism is a form of Pelagianism, which of course in the Catholic tradition is frequently identified or labeled as a heresy. But Professor Nelson has a number of very fascinating things to say about that. So welcome, Professor Nelson. Thank you so much for your generosity of time. And we hope you're well there in the Boston area. I'm assuming you're there right now.
Hanging in, like everyone else. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for being here. And actually, I want to circle around to his early book, because that's the one that sort of leads us into our discussion of Thomas More's Utopia, which is what we'll be talking about today. I believe it's your first book, right? The Greek Tradition in Republican Thought.
Yeah.
Okay. So Professor Nelson has done quite a bit of work on Thomas More, who we've been thinking about. And one of the things I really wanted to ask him, and I'm just going to ask him maybe 3-4 questions, and then I really want to open up to our senior and junior fellows so you guys can get in there, because it really is a treat to have him here. But one question I really want to ask him, just to kind of get out there his view of Thomas More, because like a lot of his scholarship, it's often kind of iconoclastic and goes against the grain, is that in the 20th century, More scholarship, Thomas More scholarship, tended to de-radicalize. There tended to be a de-radicalizing movement. Some of this probably has to do with the French Revolution. A lot of it has to do with the Cold War, and Catholics in particular, but other readers of More being worried that utopian thought has been discredited by either the French revolutionaries or more proximately the Soviet Revolution. And so there's a tendency for readers of More to look at More and say, you know what, he doesn't mean utopia straightforwardly. He either is being highly ironic, and these sort of revisionist de-radicalizing readings tend to emphasize that the character More, or morus in Latin, trots out Aristotelian criticisms of utopia's abolishing of private property and abolishing of money. The revisionist readings also often situate Thomas More in the Roman Republican tradition, which is less radical on questions of property. And they also frequently tend to resonate with contemporary readers and their sense that utopia is a discredited project. And so the question I want to lead off with is, one of the things that's I found instructive and fascinating about Professor Nelson's work is the way in which he, for lack of a better word, I don't know if you accept this, but re-radicalizes Moore and Utopia by situating him within Greek republicanism. So I was wondering if you might start out by just helping us as novice readers of Utopia. What exactly is that move you make by which you say, no, Utopia is it's a radical document if you see it within the Platonic radical Republican tradition? And maybe you can fill in some of those terms for us and why that helps us read Utopia, maybe how that helps us understand the abolition of property and money, which have remained the most controversial parts of the program sort of unrolled in Utopia.
Well, thank you so much for well, first of all, for having me. It's a huge pleasure, and I'm only sorry we can't do this in person. So, yeah, I should also thank you for the trip down memory lane, since I actually I wrote the article on Utopia that became the first chapter of that book, I think when I was 22, and I am no longer. So it's been a while, but I'm really glad to have the opportunity to think about this stuff again, which has always been very near and dear to my heart. I think you're right. I think, and maybe the trends in more scholarship in the second half of the 20th century were sort of overdetermined. On the one hand, I think the Cold War context was undoubtedly important, particularly as so much of Catholic thought was set itself against totalitarian communism. The idea that this kind of revered saint and martyr actually might have embraced some form of it, I think was not a congenial notion. So I think that's for sure. But I also think a lot of the, I think the same conclusions were promoted by developments in historiography, particularly developments in Renaissance historiography and the explosion of rhetoric, of sort of classical and Renaissance rhetoric as a major subject. And this idea that in this kind of highly rhetorical culture, the great challenge is always, to argue the case in utramque partem, as the tagline had it, on both sides, and to make even an outlandish case seem plausible as a display of one's virtuosity as a humanist, as a classicist. Since Moore was certainly moving in this sort of humanist, highly rhetorical discourse, that wasn't a stupid thought. I mean, and so the idea that what we have here is a kind of game where you have two protagonists, Moore himself, presented ironically, self-deprecatingly, but nonetheless making his case, and Hyflide making the other case, right? That either what we have is just a rhetorical exercise in which Moore doesn't take a side at all, and the point is just to sort of show the ability of a humanist education to surround a subject and make a good case for any position within some kind of discursive field. Or that, in fact, he is to be identified with the character Moore, and that Moore is the sort of authorial voice, the parole, and that this is a kind of amusing flight of fancy, but at the end we're brought firmly down to planet Earth when Moore the character says, well, this has all been pretty silly, and so I think a lot of that sort of converged to produce highly skeptical readings. I mean, that is, readings that were very reluctant to take Utopia seriously as a reflection of Moore's own political and philosophical commitments, circa 1516. And so that, I think that's right. I mean, why did I go the other way at that time? I think for sure it was significantly to do with the fact that Quentin Skinner was my teacher. And I had just started, it was my first year of graduate work. And sort of two things were happening simultaneously. One was that I had, and even as an undergraduate, I'd been very influenced by this contextual approach to political theory and the history of political thought. And my instinct was always, and to some degree remains, to try to situate these texts in the discursive world in which they appeared, and try to get a sense of what the author was doing when writing this text. I mean, what is he trying to say? What is he trying to accomplish? And what clues could we sort of glean about that question from studying very carefully everything else that he and his friends were writing, and who their enemies were, and what they were up against. And so that was, first of all, my instinct. And then second of all, this was at the time when Skinner, so I was sitting in Cambridge on his lectures on Renaissance political thought. And this was really, the year 2000. So this is sort of right in the thick of his engagement with what he ends up calling the Neo-Roman tradition, and which he traced with such spectacular persuasive force from, just a little scene setting for those who might not know the inside baseball of all this. In general, it was very common up until about 25 years ago to tell the story of Republican political thought in particular as a story that really is downstream from the recovery of Aristotle in the 13th century. And that Aristotle's politics, once it, in these Latin translations, which are, hyper literal, but, and kind of cloying, but nonetheless, give you a decent sense of what Aristotle is talking about, as they become available in the middle 13th century, you get this kind of Aristotelian idea about participatory politics, and the sort of particularly the stuff from the first several books of the Politics, and then book 6, really giving rise to these enthusiastic ideas about a particular kind of communal self-government, which were not present before. And what Skinner pointed out, and others had anticipated this argument at various different times, but no one had ever put it as sweepingly and as persuasively, I think, is just that that's false. That actually the sort of communal, particularly when we're talking about Italy and the so-called Regnum Italicum, the Italian realm, which remained as a theoretical matter under the Holy Roman Empire in the High Middle Ages, but had de facto separated into these this multitude of self-governing cities. They had developed this communal, we might now say with scare quotes, Republican ideology, but they knew nothing about Aristotle's politics, and they were getting this all from Roman sources, which were never lost, unlike Aristotle. And that's really the red thread. So the Republican tradition is kind of very Roman tradition, and the Aristotelian recovery is sort of a sideshow. A terrible caricature, but that's
if I can for a second, I think that's helpful, because part of the de-radicalizing of More is to situate him in this Roman Republican tradition that tends to emphasize the necessity of things like private property, amongst other things. Whereas you say, no, there's this other kind of republicanism that comes from Plato and the Greeks, particularly Plato, though. And actually, we should be reading more within that more radical tradition. In a sense, you were going against your advisor, which is a time-honored tradition in academia.
Well, I was, yes. I mean, well, there's a whole story about that, which I can tell you if you want. But he was marvelous about it. He's a saintly human being. But yes, so I was listening to these lectures, and Utopia was sort of in the last week, and the whole, I was, on the bus for the entire argument. And then when we got to Utopia, I thought, gosh, precisely because everything else was so persuasive, this is bothering me. And so I then, as an experiment, thought, well, what if I try to apply this, this kind of contextual method as I understand it to the text to try to account for what I'm finding strange about the argument that this is a kind of neo-Roman text. And then, what I found, or at least what I thought I found, I mean, none of this has ever ceased to be very controversial, is that if you look at More's intellectual context in this moment, the central fact about it is that he is engaged, along with all of his friends and allies, in a culture war over the study of Greek. That these were the first men in England to learn Greek, to study it. They were under fearsome attack, not least because of the destabilizing threat of giving people the ability to read the Gospels in Greek rather than in the Vulgate. This actually led to riots in places like Oxford. I mean, More was very involved in this sort of bit of cultural politics. And what you see is that all of these people, Erasmus, who was his great friend, and other people like Richard Pacey and John Collin, and all of these people are writing these pamphlets defending Greek and the study of Greek and Greek culture and Greek philosophy, and against Romanitas, against Latinity, and arguing that basically what the Romans give you is sort of crap, and but if you really want to understand philosophy, you'll go back to the Greek sources, and you have to learn Greek. And these people were also uniformly Platonists, and for them, Plato was the ultimate Greek philosophical source. And they began to make these arguments about primitive Christianity and its highly Platonic character. So in a way, this is a tradition that you see already, of course, in Augustine, but of thinking that, look, Platonism is kind of as close as you can get to Christianity without the gospel. And of course, the moment is dramatized in Utopia in book 2, when they're finally they're told the story of Christ. They go, oh, of course, right? Because it's just the natural next step if you're pagan Platonists, which is what the Utopians are when we meet them. And once you then see that, you see that in all of their pamphlets and in all of their letters, they are arguing this stuff, right? I mean, that's to say, including the endorsement of communism, of sharing, and the attack on private property, the attack on ideas about glory and civic greatness and empire, and all of the stuff that Roman political theory organized itself around. And so that was really the genesis of it. Yeah.
What would you, if you had to give a sort of quick definition of Platonic communism and its sort of resonances with primitive Christianity, as you mentioned, in the Erasmian circle, what would you say that is? Because I think we hear communism and we think Marx, we think materialist history, we think the modern state, and that's all anachronistic. So what was it that made a community of property compelling to Erasmus, More, and the humanists at this time?
Yes, of course. So when we're talking about communism here, we're talking small c. Just the idea of communal living and the holding of things in common, which is itself, a complicated part of the Platonic inheritance, because, of course, in the Republic, there is communal living, but only in the guardian class, right? As many of you will know, it's not generalized to the entire polis. There's a hint in a famous passage of the Laws in Book 5, which More knew. The Laws, remember, they had the Republic very early. The Laws was really recovered very late. The first time we even find anyone referring to it is in the last decade of the 15th century. So this is really just 10 years, 15 years or so before Utopia. There, you actually get this Platonic endorsement of the idea that in the best state, all people will, the maxim that among, so this is this adage that Erasmus makes central to his adagia, and that More uses too, that among friends all things are common. And that in the best city, the citizens would all live as friends, and they would share everything, not just property, but wives, children, and their entire lives. And More, of course, More and Erasmus didn't get on board with the wife sharing, but they did. They related, and they weren't alone in doing this at all. They related the passage in the laws about communal living and the idea that among friends all things are in common to the account of the apostolic church in the Acts of the Apostles, and the sort of famous passage that talks about the apostles in the early church agreeing to share everything, and then you have this sort of famous story of Ananias, cheating, promising to give over all his property, but then withholding it, being struck dead. And so they sort of related these things. And so More writes a letter. I mean, this is in his own voice, just about 18 months after he publishes Utopia, in which he explicitly says, and this is just repeating something that Erasmus had already written about at length, long before Utopia, that nothing that Plato said has ever come closer to the judgment of Christ than this idea about sharing. And so that's, I think, how they thought about it.
Yeah, and that's a really helpful transition to the second question I wanted to ask you, maybe more briefly, is how is it that Erasmus and More look back at scripture, both Hebrew and New Testament, and see these Platonic elements in the political theology of, as you wonderfully put it, among friends all things are in common, or Hythliday's really paradoxical statement in Utopia that money was developed so that people could have a sort of fluid movement of things, but instead it has paradoxically become a wall so that only some people have things. And so unless you abolish money, money is actually, although it's supposed to create a fluidity of things, is actually creating a blockage of things. What do you say to a modern reader? Here at Nova Forum, we care a lot about political theology. We talk a lot about it, a long history of Catholic political theology, but political theology more generally. It's really, it kind of dissonant in the ears of I think, modern religious people, I think it's fair to say, Protestant, Jewish, Christian, that that political theology points in this direction. We tend to think of political theology, the dominant view, let's say, roughly, is that political theology would say that a community of property, the abolition of money, are unbiblical. You mentioned the Acts of the Apostles, but are there other places, are there other elements of theology that Erasmus and More were looking at such that they would come to these conclusions?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and I could go on and on about it. Just to be brief, I mean, a couple of things. One is, have to remember that these guys are inheriting not just the Platonic tradition, but the Neoplatonic tradition. And going back to antiquity itself, you have this idea of a deep compatibility between Plato and Scripture, which even led to the very widespread belief that Plato had traveled to Egypt and had met Moses and had and we giggle about this, but they took it deadly seriously. Diogenes' Life of Plato emphasizes his travels around the Mediterranean, particularly to Egypt. This kind of spurious text that called the Navigatio Platonis, which was appended to the early editions of Plato, gives you this same sort of thing. So the idea that, by the way, same kind of thing with Homer. But this is this was a kind of attempt to bring Athens and Jerusalem together and say, well, actually, Platonism and Scripture are emanations of the same fundamental truth, which both had access to. So that's just a general point. But what's very interesting is the way that different parts of Scripture could be used on this question of property. in very different ways. And so, as you may know, one of the things that I wrote about in that book, and I've written about quite a lot since, is this debate not about communal property, but about egalitarian distributions of property. And of course, those are very different, right? So the Platonic ideal, as understood in this utopian, this kind of Erasmian circle, is no one should have property, everyone should share. Then you have this other view, which is that everyone should have roughly the same. And of course, Plato gives you a version of that in the Laws himself, and for the non-guardians in the Republic. That's what that's the idea there. And so the question is then, how should you think about this? And More in Utopia is the character. I mean, the character Hythloday, rather, is very clear. He thinks this is a terrible idea. Says, if you just try to use laws to ensure that everyone has roughly the same, it's a disaster. It's like poultices applied to a wound, he says, and you're just going to get into trouble. So either you do communal living or you do just kind of private property, and you let the chips fall where they may. But this idea of trying to regulate the amount is foolhardy. Well, of course, that was very consonant in the early 16th century with the view that these people, mostly reading Roman sources, had taken of the most famous attempt in antiquity to do this, that is to use the law to limit how much stuff people could have, which were the Roman agrarian laws, which everyone agreed in the Roman tradition that they read was responsible for the collapse of the Roman Republic and its descent into civil war. Later, and not much later, by the end of the 16th century and particularly the early 17th century, you get people reconsidering this and saying, well, hey, those laws, the Roman laws, look a lot like the Levitical laws. They look a lot like the Jubilee and the sabbatical year and the debt forgiveness, and so this idea not of communal living but of regulated egalitarian private property becomes the model, right? So Scripture had a lot to say that was very different in different parts about these matters, but clearly the more Erasmus thought is that communal living is part of the higher order of the gospel, right? So that yes, this kind of egalitarian distribution of private property might have sufficed, in the old dispensation, but true disciples of Christ would embrace the sort of the full Monty. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And actually, another thing that I think is covering over, at least on the Erasmian and Morean view, proper political theology is this sort of Platonic problem of conventional or customary opinion that is passed down. And so custom is kind of maybe covered over and encrusted theology in such a way that you have to sort of recover it via Plato and the Greeks. Just to our senior and junior fellows, this will be my last question. So please be thinking of anything you want to get in on. I think that it's a real opportunity. Feel free to just grab an observation from the text. I know we've all been reading Utopia, or pose a question challenging the account that Professor Nelson gives. He very clearly, sort of says, this is a very tendentious account, though I admit I find it persuasive because it puts it in the context of the Erasmian.
Hopefully not tendentious, just controversial. I wasn't going for tendentious.
So the last question I want to end on is this issue, because one of the other things I've learned from your Utopia scholarship is maybe the best way to put it, because I often do like to be tendentious myself, is tendentiously, which is the modern radical egalitarian left tends to put together two things that More and Erasmus do not put together. The modern egalitarian left tends to think there's a wisdom to the masses. Think of someone like Karl Marx thinking that the working class will be radicalized toward communism, one of the disappointments of Marxism. And that goes together with a kind of radical agenda of egalitarianism, right? Of some sort of reshaped society along the various complicated possibilities that you were just hinting at. And yet what we find in Hythloday and in More is this conflict between this sort of Platonic notion that received opinion is actually a kind of folly, in Erasmus's term, that you can't really go by it, that most people are sort of clueless as to the right way to order society. And so Hyflide, unlike modern radicals, is very strange, because when you read Utopia, he's both infinitely demanding about the kind of transformation he thinks would make for a just society, but he comes across as sort of elitist in that he's not really willing to participate in political action. In the famous dialogue on council in book 1, he just sort of says, no, I'm not going into the Council of Kings. I'm not doing anything to help change the situation because the situation is so bad and so far gone. Now, you put this in terms of the ancient split that recurred in the Renaissance between the vita contemplativa and the vita activa. And the vita contemplativa was something that arose out of Platonism, that the highest life was one of contemplation. And the vita activa, out of the Roman tradition, that the highest life roughly was one of political participation. And Hyflide basically says, I'm a committed Platonist of sorts. The life of contemplation is higher. So even though I have this incredibly demanding view of justice, I'm not going to do anything about it. Whereas More's dramatic persona in the dialogue says, you have to do something to make things a little bit better. You have to kind of get in there. And so I guess my question is, for modern readers, it's hard for us not to be anachronistic. And these look like really clashing principles. Hyflide both seems way more elitist than a lot of us are, but he also seems a lot more radical than a lot of contemporary Americans are. Do we have something to learn from Hyflide and this kind of joining of the vita contemplativa and this high demand for justice? Or is that a tension and a problem in More's humanism that was never resolved and maybe led to its collapse as a political project?
It's such a good question, and it's something that I've thought. I mean, it's in a way a kind of theme in a lot of my work, including later work that's not related specifically to Utopia, and that is the relationship between egalitarianism in different forms and hierarchy or hierarchical accounts of human nature. And I think that what you identify as a puzzle or a dissonance is present not just in More, but in Platonism itself, and indeed in much subsequent egalitarian political theory. That is, the thing about Plato, which modern readers find very difficult to wrap their heads around, is that what you get is the advocacy of radical means, let's say abolition of private property, communal, sharing of wives and children, and all the, these kind of radical egalitarian reforms, but in the service of explicitly hierarchical ends. Right, that Plato's anthropology, right, is, and that it's not just that those two coexist. The second explains the first for Plato, right? Why do you want to have, communal property or relatively equal property or whatever? Well, he gives a couple of reasons, but the most important one is that you don't want there to be rich and poor people. Why? Well, because if you have rich and poor people, then just as a matter of course, the rich will end up ruling. But the rich will be corrupted by their wealth and by the sort of the too muchness of their state, and also are not and just because you're rich doesn't mean that you were born with supereminent rational capacities. And so what you want is to eliminate wealth as a rival claim to political authority, so that what remains by default is just outstanding wisdom and virtue, right? So there's some small number of men or women, if you're Plato, interestingly, who have been designed by nature to rule, right? And they are by nature more rational, more virtuous, capable of contemplating the forms or whatever it is, and everybody else is not. And those people who are inferior find their good in being ruled. So the radical means are there to promote the rule of a wise elite, right? That is taken to be natural, right? And of course, More picks this up directly, right? This is the whole kind of meritocratic system of Utopia. I mean, the sort of the wise who are freed from the demands of work and left to sort of get on with the business of training as philosopher kings. No, I think that's absolutely right. But I think it's true of so many apparently different kinds of egalitarianism. I mean, think of something like, contemporary liberal Rawlsian egalitarianism. It too says, well, unless it's to the benefit of the least well off, everybody should have the same. Now that's a big unless, right? Because you have lots of people who believe that some inequality might be necessary to maximize the well-being of the least well off. But that's an empirical matter. What, as a matter of justice, they're entitled to the same. Why? Well, because all the facts about people that cause them to be better or worse at leading productive lives are, Rawls says, arbitrary from a moral point of view, meaning it's just the cards you were dealt. And you have the separation of humanity into these two groups. The one group he calls the better endowed, and the other group he calls, the less well endowed. That is to say, those who have talents and virtue and intelligence, and those who don't. Right. So it's this very hierarchical picture of human nature. So there's these now. Of course, you don't deserve being one of the elect, and so you don't have a claim to further stuff because you happen to be one of the naturally sort of superior people. But the idea is that the situation of those who don't make a success of it is determined by their inferior nature, right? There's nothing they can do about it. And that's a very strange view for an egalitarian to take of anthropology, right? This idea that there are just these enormous kind of unbridgeable gulfs between different kinds of persons in terms of how nature has acquitted them and sort of equipped them for human life. And so, sorry, I don't mean to go on about that, but I actually think the relationship between egalitarianism and hierarchical anthropologies is not just accidental, and I don't think it's at all unique to this particular variant.
No, well said and very provocative. I mean, to this day, the sort of political slander champagne socialist picks up on this very problem of how do you, in a different form, granted, but how do you reconstruct egalitarian politics with the problem of enactment? Your dream may be very egalitarian, but how do you get there? Who decides, et cetera, et cetera?
Well,
okay,
also,
so yes, please.
Someone like Rawls, who is taken to be and took himself to be in some complicated way toward the end of his life, kind of Kantian, straightforwardly rejects Kant's anthropology, right? Which really is egalitarian, right? Because all human beings have the equal capacity to recognize and obey the moral law, right? Irrespective of their circumstances, or how favored they've been in their social position, or their natural, the sort of natural endowment. That there's a fundamental equality that human beings share in terms of their capacity to identify and pursue the right and other things. And this is something that Rawls has to completely reject.
Yeah, who can get in the original position exactly, and who can govern? Let's open it up. I see Audrey has a painting of Thomas More in her background, the famous portrait of him, which I love that, Audrey. Who wants to jump in with any question? It really is open-ended for you guys to take this chance to ask questions from a sort of top scholar of More and the Renaissance. And feel free to ask what seems like the obvious question or the urgent question, or
those are usually the best ones.
I agree. Ben, please.
Yeah, as a scholar of both More and also American political philosophy, can you talk a bit about the importance that More places on putting utopia in the New World? And I think there's a great line in book one where he talks about, it's kind of ironic, where he talks about like how there's monsters everywhere, but civilized people are rare. And for some reason, that really struck me as being very indicative of the noble savage trope. But I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think it's such a good question, and the answer isn't obvious at all. I mean, but it goes. I think part of the answer. Look, we also don't want to be overly reductive about this. Part of it is he's having fun. I mean, he wants to. This is the age of discovery. These new places are, these voyages are taking place. Of course, that's the setting, right? Hyphlide. Was on one of these great voyages of discovery, and there is an intense preoccupation with the new world and what people are like there, and what the sort of what that which we discover in the new world has to say about preconceived notions that Europeans have about all kinds of things, including how people are by nature and so on. But I think for Moore, as one of these, as sort of a paid up Erasmian, it's also to show, to sort of say, well, what would a world that had never come into contact with these corrosive European norms and conventions look like? Now, this world will look ridiculous from Europe, right? From the point of view of Europe, and that's that's one of the points of the text. These are all nonsense words, right? Hyphlide, the name, means a purveyor of nonsense. All the peoples he's describing, the Greek etymologies, and of course it's important they're all in Greek, are people of much nonsense, silly people that don't exist, whatever it is. And so all of this is going to look like nonsense from a particular point of view, namely the point of view of civilized Europe. But from the point of view of these Erasmians, civilized Europe has been deeply corrupted by the sort of, and Erasmus is the one who kind of gives the fullest statement of this. It's really been corrupted by the Roman law. So the fact that Rome conquers Europe and then the Roman law spreads. And what does the Roman law do? Well, the Roman law creates private property and tells you that justice means giving everyone that which is his. It tells you you should repel force with force, and whereas Erasmus is defending pacifism, right? It tells you that you should seek office and glory, and all of this stuff. So basically, the idea is, if you are in this kind of Rome-besotted European world, none of this will even occur to you, right? And it'll seem outlandish. But in this place, that's sort of that's out of time, that never inherited Romanitas. This is the sort of common sense, right? And so I think that's a big part of the answer. But I think there are so many answers. Part of it is for sure just because it's fun and sort of it's an opportunity for the imagination to just run riot, and so many people. I mean, the shock and excitement of the New World discoveries was very real, and we shouldn't downplay that. So it's not that I want to give a simple answer to that, but I think that's one of the issues.
Yeah, and that's a great point that I just want to highlight for all our fellows, which is in terms of political theology, Erasmus and Moore have something provocative to tell us, which is that their view of custom, which they inherit from Plato, but they give a new kind of meaning to, is that it is a kind of inherited form of sin, to use the theological term. And so custom, I think what Professor Nelson's saying here, has covered over Europe so thoroughly with Romanitas that in some sense, the New World, to Ben's question, is the Greeks. They've discovered like natural Greeks in some sense. Audrey, you have your hand up.
Because the idea this is natural reason, right? You don't even need Plato for this. And of course, they haven't read Plato. I mean, that when they're given Plato, they've just kind of naturally become Platonists. And so that's, I think that's absolutely right. And remember, when we're talking about the Roman law, what they're thinking of in particular is the Roman concept of the jus gentium, right? Roman law separates it has these sort of well, three categories, but the third is not important for now. The two big ones are natural law, jus naturale, right, and then the jus gentium, the law of peoples. And the idea is that there is sort of what exists by nature, but then there's what human communities over time have uniformly adopted as a matter of custom because reason tells them to do it, because reason tells them that these institutions are necessary for flourishing social human lives. And for most Roman lawyers, that set includes basically everything: property, matrimony, slavery, warfare, all the rest of it. And so it's basically, what would a world without the jus gentium look like? Is what they're trying to imagine.
Yeah, thank you. Audrey, did you want to jump in?
Yes, I have a really quick question. It's more of a fun question. Would you want to live in More's Utopia?
Oh God, no. 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 But there's a deep question about whether More wanted to live in More's Utopia. I mean, I think, that can mean, as I hear it, two different things. One is, does he really think this is, in some sense, the ideal, as the subtitle of the text is De Optima Republicae Status, right? The best state of a commonwealth. Does he think that that's what this really is? I think he probably does. But does he think it's realizable in sort of tolerable form in the human world? That's, I think, a very open question, because Moore, among other things, remained all his life a deep Augustinian in lots of important ways, and his first sustained sort of intellectual project was this set of lectures on Augustine, which he delivered in London and which have never been found. You should all go and try to find them. That they exist somewhere, and someone will get lucky and become greatly glorious because of this. There is this idea of a fallen world, and whether Moore thinks this is as it were ideal and actionable, or whether he simply thinks it's an ideal that's beyond us, I think is a very open question.
Hannah, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, this has been really intriguing. I'm wondering if you could go into a little bit on the sort of coexistence of this, of utopia in its sort of everyone shares kind of small c communist society, with like this really intense set of like punishments, as well as the existence of slavery in this world, and like also like does that somehow like illuminate like any bit of Moore's like personal perspective and what on the lens that he's trying to look at this kind of a society with? I'm just wondering if you could like go into a little bit more sort of that aspect of it.
Yeah, well, there's a lot in what you're asking. I think one of the things that we have to say is that this is another, and in a way this gets back to Ben's question, that one of the important parts of the answer to the question, why is this set in the New World, right, is because Moore is thinking in a very real way about the Americas, and about questions of empire, and what is just and unjust in European expansion. And one of the most notorious passages in Utopia is the one from Book 2, where we hear that the utopians believe that it is a matter of natural law, jus naturale, that you must be industrious, that you must make use of the land that you claim, and that if you don't make use of it, others are allowed to come and make use of it instead. And if you block them, war can be waged against you. So it's a very striking moment in Utopia, not least because it's not the sort of argument that Erasmus would make. So this is a point of disagreement that's interesting. But of course, that becomes the central natural law argument for European expansion into the Americas, namely that the native peoples don't engage in agriculture. They don't. They have a sort of barter subsistence economy, but they don't actually make the land productive and useful, and therefore, as a matter of natural law, others are to be let in to do that in their stead. And if they refuse permission, then they can be met with punitive war. So this is so these ideas of punishment, natural law, and that cluster of thoughts has a very real New World context, right? I mean, that we shouldn't lose sight of. I mean, you see exactly the same in Locke, right? This is just the beginnings of a very of what becomes a central sort of argument in favor of empire. So that's one thing. But of course, all of the stuff about war making, punishment and punitive war. Remember, one of the things that's so striking and would have struck readers of the text as just extraordinary is the discussion of utopian military practices, right? The fact that they practice assassination, that they have no problem lying, cheating, biting, stealing, whatever. The idea is, now, why do they do this? It sounds a lot like Machiavelli or something like that. And of course, the relationship is a very interesting one. There's no reason to think that More would have known the prince at this point, but it remains an open question because the prince did circulate in manuscript, but it's a very tight window because Machiavelli finishes it in 1513, so we're only talking about a very short time. But anyway, but of course the utopian reason is completely different. The Machiavellian reason you do this is because you want to be glorious and victorious, and it's just that Machiavelli thinks in practice this is the way to do it. If you're a utopian, you just want the war to end because you hate war, right? So war is so terrible that you should do anything necessary to make it stop and to make it quick. So it's a lot of the stuff in book 2. All of it is fascinating, and the discussions of legitimate slavery is fascinating. So there's tons in the text that's worth talking and thinking about.
And I know that some scholars have emphasized in the case of slavery that slavery is mostly punitive and rehabilitative. So it's mostly used as punishment, and then
that's the Platonism, right? Because remember, and More, must think this as a Platonist, that the point of punishment, because remember, one of the central, most controversial Platonic doctrines is no one ever knowingly does wrong, right? So the idea of retribution ceases to make any sense, right? Because you only do wrong out of ignorance. And so the point of punishment is either going to be deterrence, which is to say educating other people, or therapy, educating the wrongdoer, him or herself, by reforming. And it's one of the reasons that Plato is one of the first theorists of prison. So and this is an idea that More picks up for sure.
Which makes his conception of slavery, not that I would ever justify it, but very different than just conceptually than both chattel slavery, which we're familiar with in the United States, which is both racialized, and if you like, sort of capitalized, like you trade in slaves and own people, and also very different from classical antiquities conception of slavery. And if I can just put a word in there, and this is not original to me by any means, but you can think of more on two levels. Propositionally, what does he say substantively a utopia should look like? But he's also an inaugurator, if you like, in the modern sense of utopian thinking. And I just want to say in Moore's defense that often we deploy more utopian thinking against him to then say, you haven't been utopian enough, you know? And so when we say, would you want to live in utopia? Well, I would say it depends which policies, like the 6-hour-a-day work week and the like democratization of leisure, free public lectures. I love that in the morning. We've kind of done that at Nova. What's that?
5 a.m. lectures. I don't know that you want them, but okay.
Yeah, but there's a difference between what's substantively proposed and also the sort of exercise of this kind of thinking that I think is important to see in Moore's case. Emery, you were up. You had a question for us or thought?
Thank you. Yeah, I was kind of just going off of what you were both talking about, how the utopian society is interacting with the other societies around it, and it often, doesn't strike our modern senses as great. They have foreign slaves, they have kind of dirty war tactics, and when I was reading it, I couldn't really make sense of whether Moore was saying that utopian society works as a polis or as a country, but can this work on a global scale, or do the utopians need non-utopian societies to kind of contrast with?
It's such a good question. I mean, I think here again, the sort of Platonic models are very important, because most of these, not the stuff about war making, which is weird, but a lot of the stuff about dealing with foreigners and relations with foreign cities, and the elaborately regulated sort of set of interactions that you get imagined in Utopia is just lifted directly out of Plato's laws. Where the same, and the answer, so now that's just kicking the can down the road. So you might ask, well, what does Plato, what does a Platonist think about the answer to that question? And I think the view is that Plato never assumed for a moment that all cities would be correctly regulated, and therefore that you could just have a world of sort of safe cities with which to interact. There's a kind of, maybe you want to call it a kind of realism or pessimism that most cities will be badly governed, and because most won't be willing to take this medicine, right? They won't turn themselves entirely over to a lawgiver like a Lycurgus, or like the lawgivers of Magnesia and the laws, or Plato himself. Remember, he has this. He's asked to be a lawgiver, by Dionysius of Syracuse, and it doesn't go well at all. So the idea is most cities just will not be willing to live justly, and so the question is, there's almost an analogy between the just city and the just man in the unjust city, right? So Plato famously in Book 6 of the Republic says, and this is what sets up the debate of the dialogue of counsel in Book 1 of Utopia that Jason was talking about earlier. Should you lead the active life? Should you try to help and contribute to public affairs in an unjust city? And the Platonic answer is unambiguously no, right? Because that's like you're the only person. There's a rainstorm, everyone is getting soaked, and you're under a little ledge and you're being kept dry. And if you go out and try to rescue other people, you won't dry them, you'll just get soaked, right? And so by analogy, you withdraw, right? In the unjust city, you withdraw and you engage in the contemplative life, and you try to have as little to do with the unjust world around you as possible, so that you maintain your virtue. And that's now, of course, in a just city, it's a different matter. But likewise, so the just city, right, in relation to unjust cities, withdraws, right? It does its own thing. It doesn't want to interact with foreigners and with citizens of these unjust cities because it doesn't want its own mores to be corrupted. So there's this kind of keeping interaction to a minimum, rejecting the idea that what you want is to become a famous, mighty city by conquering other cities, right? Which is the Roman idea. You have no interest in other cities. You don't want to run other cities. You want to kind of remain hermetically sealed off from them. And that's all, that just comes straight from Plato.
That's excellent. Thank you. Chase Mendoza, who's a former student of mine, not one of our fellows. We're happy to have him here. You have a question for us or thought?
Yes, thank you, Professor Nelson. I really appreciate what you've said so far. Thanks for inviting me, Professor Blakely. Appreciate it. One of my central questions, I guess, and kind of relating back to what Ben has said, does Utopia, to use kind of some of Vogelin's really technical terms here, but immanentize the eschaton? Do you think that it takes, because you said before that there's some kind of distinction, of course, between the city of God and the city of man, and if Utopia, or if More is in this tradition of being very much Augustinian, does he make this kind of mistake of trying to bring in the city of God into the city of man? And then also relating this back to kind of the Republican tradition, the Platonic tradition, I mean, there are some interpretive strategies of reading the Republic as not necessarily a treatise on government per se, but also a treatise on education, because in the beginning of I forget which, I think it's book 2, he skips over what was considered the just city, the city of pigs, the city without relishes. So I wonder if we read it in the same way as some people have read the Republic. Is he actually immanentizing the eschaton, or is he doing something else here? So that's kind of my main central question, but also I'm curious about these interpretive strategies as well.
Yeah, terrific. So I think in a way, the question about the Republic, working backwards, the question about the Republic gets to something I was talking about at the beginning, which is about the relationship between the Republic and the laws. Right. So there are different ways of thinking about this, but clearly the Erasmians take the idea that the Republic, the city of the Republic, is not the best city, precisely because of that hinge moment in book 2 and the sort of the move away from the sort of just city to the fevered city, right? And that's what explains the in this way of interpreting the Republic, that's what explains the limitation of the communal way of life to the guardians, right? Because basically, I mean, you remember the way it goes. Now, okay, the city needs luxuries. Because it needs luxuries, it needs to make war. So it needs guards, and they're going to have to live in this separate way. And so everything that happens afterwards, the tripartite structure, is downstream from that kind of fateful move. And the Erasmian Morean idea is that the best city is one in which everyone lives like a guard, right? It's not it's not the city of the Republic. It's the city that's described very briefly in the laws, right? So it's not the city of the laws, which is obviously, so I mean, if you want to think about it, you can imagine the Magnesia in the laws is a kind of a third best, right? The first best would be the perfect city that's just glanced at in the laws, but which Moore is working with here in Utopia, where everyone shares everything. Then the second best might be something like the Republic, and then the third best would be the city of laws, right? The Magnesia. Anyway, that's not to say it's certainly the right or the only way to read that text, but it's clearly the way they did. So it's very striking how few of the utopian institutions are actually taken from the Republic. Many more are taken from the laws. So anyway, that's the one thought. the question about the relationship of Utopia, and was he making them, from the point of view of an Augustinian, was he making the mistake of seeking a kind of prelapsarian salvation in the fallen world, in the city of man? There, the question is, this gets back to the something we were discussing earlier, namely, what does he think he's doing here, right? So if what he thinks he's doing is offering a blueprint for political reform, then you might say yes. You might say he might be, then he would be vulnerable to the charge that he's making that mistake, or at least that he's vulnerable to the charge of incoherence, because his Augustinianism it doesn't go along with that. That is the idea of utopia as a viable project of reform. If you think of it instead as his sketch of what the ideal life in a city would look like, even though it's not one that we can bring into being in the world in which we live, then it's more compatible with his Augustinianism. And I myself don't think there's a clear answer to this question. And I'm not even sure that he thought there was a clear answer to that question. I mean, I think there are parts of Utopia that sit very awkwardly with any kind of Orthodox Christianity, particularly in Book 2, particularly Utopia, the sort of long discussion of utopian ethics, which is, Epicurean in structure in some important ways, and certainly seems to deny that sort of salvation and virtuous living come only through faith in Christ. So the question of what he's actually doing here is, I don't want to make it seem more easy than it actually is. And as I say, I don't know that we have to believe that at all times he knew which side of the line he was on, whether this is a kind of imagination of what the best city could look like, could we but bring it into being, but oh, by the way, we can't, until until the world changes. And by the way, the relationship between utopianism and millenarianism in the later 16th and 17th centuries is profound. So most of the major utopian writers, people like Campanella, were also millenarians, and Campanella's City of the Sun is explicitly a city in which to kind of wait out the apocalypse. I think it's a really interesting question, and I wouldn't force an answer down your throat. I think that's sort of for all of you to decide for yourself.
Maybe a last question from our director, Professor Albertson.
Well, thank you. Thank you for such a rich conversation. And I'll just try to frame a question maybe we can talk about briefly. I know we're at the end of our time, but maybe also one for our group to think about. We started off by looking at the reception of More as a utopian thinker, as an egalitarian, a communist lowercase c thinker, and the dis-ease with that notion among some Catholic readers. And I was wondering on the other side, sort of, how was More received with respect to the break between Protestant and Catholic Christianity and among his early modern readers? I mean, there are some elements in Book 2. There's the religion of the utopians. There's the feast days that are sort of, secularized versions of Catholic religious life. But there's also these other conspicuous elements, like the episode where the priest dies, and so they can only do lay sacrament, the sacraments that can be passed along without a priest. So they talk about they can continue with at least baptism, and there's a hint in the notes maybe of marriage. But this is essentially a reduction, the two sacraments that are sustained in Lutheran Protestantism in 1516 by the author who's deeply invested in a Gnosis Augustine, but it's also like Erasmus, promoting access to the Greek and the politics of accessing the Greek New Testament in a different version of a lay organized vision of Christian life. So I was wondering, what did people make of More's Catholic identity among the 16th or 17th century readers who were thinking about the proximity of religion and politics during this violent century between Protestants and Catholics?
It's such a good question. I mean, and just there's a lot to say about it. I mean, the first thing to say is that the answer isn't uniform, but that many of the reformers, particularly in the later 16th century and into the 17th century, regarded the Erasmians and even more, to some interesting extent, despite the fact that he was a Catholic martyr, as sort of proto-reformers. These people were part of their own intellectual history, the story they told about the coming of the Reformation, and you know the fearsome attacks on the Catholic Church in the Praise of Folly, and in the writings of virtually all of the Erasmians, and this attempt to go back to a primitive Christianity, bypassing what they regarded as deep-seated corruptions in sort of Roman Catholic Europe, was very resonant with the message of the reformers a few years later. But of course, the context had completely changed, and Erasmus, you know, and More don't become reformers. They sort of, you know, and they begin attacking the sort of Protestant movement, and of course More himself, quite notoriously, you know, had quite a lot of Protestants burnt, and his own tone later toward the end of his life. I mean, you know, but we're talking about the More of you know, of the 15 teens as opposed to the More of the 1530s. When a lot of water has gone under the bridge, and so, you know, there is, you know, no Protestant has anything nice to say about his answer to Tyndale, but the kind of the humanist More remains usable in an interesting kind of way, despite the fact. Now, part of that is also that the English works, as you probably know, were first of all much more difficult to read if you were a continental European who didn't read English. But also, even if you did read English, the collected English works were published in 1557 under Mary, just in the last year of her reign. But you know, Elizabeth comes to the throne in 1558, and that's it. So so publication of the English works shuts down, and so the More that you have in continental Latin Europe is the earlier More, the More of the Lucian, of the Utopia, of his letters that are translated, and you know, those were used by people who were Protestants, you know, very interestingly, and there were Protestant utopias that were written very much in you know, in self-conscious imitation of More, and More became a hero to figures like James Harrington, who was, you know, unimpeachably Protestant. You know, it's a very interesting story that also has to do with the development of subsequent ruptures within Protestantism. So, and that's just, you know, and then I'll shut up, but just let me flag the general issue that once you get the rise of proper Reformed Calvinist theology, and once, you know, and you get in, you know, into the earlier 17th century and the split into sort of Arminian, broadly speaking, and Calvinist camps, you have this elision of, you know, in the mind of the Reformed, in the minds of Orthodox Calvinists, of Arminians and Papists, right? Because they both seemed in some way to emphasize works, right? And the ability to, and the freedom of the will, the idea that the will is in some way free to choose at the very least, to cooperate with grace, if not to merit salvation. And Erasmus had been the great champion of that view, right? And so if you were and Moore as well. So if you were if you were a later Arminian or even Socinian Protestant, someone who leaned very far that way, you might have quite a lot more sympathy for the Erasmian circle than you would, let's say, Calvin and subsequent Reformed theologians. So it's all very interesting. So I mean that's just a terrible caricature of what's a really complicated story. But the answer is Moore was used widely in the Protestant world.
That's helpful to think about. I mean, for those who aren't following all the subgroups, but the Arminian Socinians would be Protestants who emphasize the integrity of human nature still, which is more like what the Catholic view was generally originally versus Luther and Calvin. So this is, in other words, it's a much more optimistic sense of the potentials of human reason and the freedom of the will to join in new rational communities and form polities, without any sort of deeply corrupted human mechanism that would prevent that, which is more of the Lutheran Calvinist view.
Yes, and we have to remember that even
Protestantism.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we have to remember, just circling back to Chase's question about Augustine, have to remember that, even to talk about what it was to be an Augustinian in the early 16th century is not a straightforward business, because is it the Augustine of the De Libero Arbitrio, or is it the Augustine of the anti-Pelagian writings from the end of his life and the perseverance of the saints and so on. The question of how degraded the will was taken to be. Was it taken to be so degraded that one actually becomes a double predestinarian, as the late Augustine does? That's entirely unclear. So Augustine after Calvin is a very different thing.
Yes. There's, you said how that looks in the 16th, 17th century, and maybe how it still looks in the 21st century, when the terms of some of our intuitions, we're still living within Augustine's setting of the debate. And a lot of what we can see happening even in the last few years of our national political conversation, I think to some extent is between those with more pessimistic views that have certain lower horizons about what could be possible politically, and then those are very optimistic views about what could be possible politically. It's not always, but sometimes those do have implicit anthropologies about what is, it begs the question about what is a human being and what are our capacities both individually and socially to do things in the world. Just to bring that back to where we started in the first part of our conversation about starting from today and a few weeks ago, January 6th, we're all still thinking about that and having conversations about what that reveals or reminds us about our national setting here.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely right. Yeah.
I'm sorry, we're just a few minutes over. I want to respect everyone's time, and especially if we can take a moment to thank Professor Blakely for guiding us through that great conversation, and especially our guest, Professor Nelson, for spending the hour with us and sharing from his deep experience with this most interesting of books and thinkers. And I'll just remind you, in the copies you have, the sort of secret extra credit at the end, beyond the book, are several chapters that are receptions of Moore, some critical essays on Moore, receptions of Moore, including by some on the political left, Marxist communists. You can read about that as well. There's a question in the chat about that. I think the Kautsky essay is important there. But also our own Professor Nelson has a selection in there that walks through some of the readings that he hinted at very quickly here. If you're interested in what we covered today, don't neglect that chapter that's included, no extra charge, in your Moore volume. So that's something else you can look at. And I hope that can be a resource for us too. We're going next to thinking about utopian science fiction and the political function of that genre as a modern possibility of the 19th and 20th, 21st centuries. And then we'll be thinking about what's happening on the ground in Los Angeles among religious communities that are also organizing themselves with new economic modes of inclusion and participation. So we're thinking with more for the rest of our seminar. So let's hang on to that book. If there's any other questions, especially from our junior fellows about practical matters, I always want to pause before we sign off. But no one wants to be the very last. I understand that. Thank you all for your attendance and participation here, and I'll be in touch about following up how we can get this represented up on our website to share some of the fruits of this conversation with others. So thank you all.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.